They tell you a will is a final instruction, a distribution of assets. It's not. In the right hands, with the right clause, a will becomes a final judgment, and the reading of it is just the beginning of the sentence. Billionaire Arthur Vance died and left his ungrateful son everything. But the inheritance came with one condition. The heir had to listen to a single recorded message. A message that would only play after $30 million were already in his name. Arthur Vance wasn't just a billionaire. He was a man who built a logistics empire by anticipating every variable. His son, Ethan, saw that fortune as a birthright, a reward for simply being born. But Arthur saw his heir differently, and in a single paragraph of legal code, buried on page 42 of his last will and testament, he engineered a confrontation from beyond the grave. What could a dead man possibly say that would make a $30 million inheritance vanish? To understand the trap, you first need to understand the two men. Arthur Vance started with a single truck in 1983. By 2018, Vance Global Logistics moved goods for half the Fortune 500. He believed in systems, predictability, and earned respect. His only son, Ethan, believed in appearances, shortcuts, and inherited privilege. Their conflict wasn't a shouting match. It was a silent 20-year erosion. Arthur was a man of brutal routine. He woke at 4:45 every morning, including Sundays. He drank his coffee black from the same chipped mug for 15 years. He could tell you the fuel efficiency of every truck in his fleet, down to the 10th of a mile. His office was a modest room in an unmarked industrial park outside Indianapolis. The wealth was real, but it was invisible, reinvested, working. He wore a $10 digital watch because, in his words, it synced perfectly with the atomic clock, and he never had to wonder if he was late. Ethan Vance grew up in boarding schools, then Ivy League business schools. His first job out of college was a vice president title at his father's company, a role Arthur reluctantly created after his wife, Elena, pleaded with him to give their son a chance. Within 6 months, Ethan had leased a Porsche, moved into a penthouse with a city view, and submitted an expense report for a $15,000 team-building weekend in Monaco. Arthur paid the invoice without comment. Then he called Ethan into his office. He didn't yell. Arthur Vance never yelled. He placed the printed expense report on the desk between them. He asked a single question. What did we learn about our freight routing from the Southeast hub that was worth $15,000? Ethan stammered about morale and networking. Arthur listened, nodded, and said, "The answer is nothing, because you didn't write it down. Money is a tool, Ethan. You used a precision lathe to hammer in a thumbtack. Don't do it again." That was the last time Arthur gave him a direct lesson. The distance grew. Ethan mastered the performance of business. The right suits, the right jargon, the right connections at charity galas. He was fantastic at being seen as a successor. But inside the company, his decisions were like sugar rush energy, brief spikes followed by costly crashes. A rush deal with a flashy tech startup cost the firm $3.2 million when the startup folded. Arthur quietly absorbed the loss on the books. He stopped inviting Ethan to strategic meetings. The real fracture happened 3 years before Arthur's diagnosis. Elena, Arthur's wife and Ethan's mother, passed away after a long illness. In her will, she left a personal jewelry collection valued at just over $2 million to her sister. She left Ethan a series of handwritten letters. Ethan was furious. He confronted his father in the driveway of the family home, accusing him of influencing his mother, of turning her against him. Arthur, standing there in an old sweater, just watched him. When Ethan finished, red-faced and breathing hard, Arthur said quietly, "Your mother made her own choices. She always did. The letters are worth more than the diamonds if you'd ever read them." Ethan never did. He had them put in a safety deposit box. He sold the Porsche and bought a more expensive one. Then, in the spring of 2022, Arthur Vance was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was severe. He had months, not years. And Arthur, the man who planned convoy routes across continents, began planning his exit. He summoned his estate lawyer, a woman named Miriam Chase, who had handled his affairs for 20 years. Their meetings were not about division. They were about conditions. Miriam later said, in a sealed deposition, that Arthur was the most clear-headed client she'd ever had at the end. He wasn't angry, he was precise. The will he drafted was 97 pages long. It contained the standard trusts, the charitable donations, the dispersal of assets. And on page 42, in subsection G of Article 7, was a clause so unusual Miriam claimed she argued against it. It stated that the primary beneficiary of the Vance family trust, Ethan James Vance, would receive control of his inheritance only after satisfying one condition. He was required to personally listen, in its entirety, to a digital audio file held in escrow by the law firm. The file was voice-locked. It could only be accessed and played after the probate court had formally approved the estate distribution. The clause stated that failure to listen to the recording, verified by a notary present in the room, would constitute a breach, freezing all assets pending a court review. Ethan would have to listen after he thought he had already won. Arthur passed away on a clear Tuesday in November. The funeral was small. Ethan wore a perfectly tailored black suit and gave a moving eulogy about his father's legacy. He nodded solemnly as friends offered condolences. Inside, he was already calculating. He knew he was the heir. He'd seen the will, though his father's lawyer had only provided summaries. The full document, with its peculiar clause, remained sealed with the court. Probate took 9 months. 9 months where Ethan began spending against the future. He put a deposit on a yacht. He started negotiations for a minority stake in a professional sports team. The day the probate court finalized the estate, Ethan walked into the offices of Chase and Lowe with the confidence of a man arriving to collect his prize. He was greeted not by a junior associate, but by Miriam Chase herself, and she was not alone. In the conference room sat a notary public with a digital recorder. On the table was a single, sleek audio player. Miriam explained the condition. Ethan's face cycled through confusion, annoyance, and finally, smug amusement. He shrugged. A final lecture from the old man? Fine, play it. I can take a few minutes of his voice for $30 million. He leaned back in the leather chair, a slight smile on his face. The notary pressed play. Arthur Vance's voice filled the room, clear, calm, and utterly devoid of sentiment. Ethan, if you're hearing this, the court has done its job and you believe you are now in control. Before you spend $1, you need to understand the price. I want you to listen to a different recording first. A recording from the security system in my home study, dated the night of March 12, 2022. The night you told me I was too sick to run my company and that you'd found a buyer to take it off my hands. Ethan's smile vanished. The color drained from his face. He stood up, his chair screeching back. Turn it off, he demanded. Miriam Chase didn't move. The notary kept the recorder running. Arthur's recorded voice continued, relentless. The buyer was a consortium led by your friend Carl Decker. The offer was 40% below market value. You told him I was cognitively impaired. You said it was a mercy. Listen to your own voice, Ethan. Then we'll talk about what you've actually inherited. From the speaker, a new voice began to play. Younger, familiar, dripping with contempt, it was Ethan's voice. The voice from the speaker was cold, transactional, utterly unlike the grieving son at the funeral. It was Ethan in his father's study, 3 weeks after the diagnosis. The doctors give you 6 months, maybe 8 with treatment, Ethan's recorded voice said. The company can't have that kind of uncertainty. The board will panic. The vultures are already circling. I found a solution. In the conference room, present-day Ethan stared at the audio player as if it were a venomous snake. He couldn't move. His own voice continued, outlining the deal. Carl Decker's consortium would buy a controlling 51% stake in Vance Global at a distressed asset valuation. The paperwork was already drafted. Ethan's cut, for facilitating the sale of his own father's life's work, was a side payment of $4 million, funneled through an offshore consultancy fee. It's a clean exit, the recorded Ethan said. You get to retire, the company gets stability, I get to manage the transition, everyone wins. Then came Arthur's voice from that night, weary but razor-sharp. Everyone, you're selling my company for 40 cents on the dollar to a man who bankrupted his last 2 acquisitions. You'd make millions. What do I get, Ethan? A slightly nicer hospice. A sigh of impatience from the recording. Don't be dramatic, Dad. You're not thinking clearly. The medication, the stress, it's clouding your judgment. This is the rational move. I'm protecting your legacy from a fire sale later. And if I say no? A long pause on the tape. Then Ethan's voice lower, firmer. Then I go to the board with a competency declaration. Dr. Shan at the clinic has already noted some confusion in your recent evaluations. It would be messy, ugly, for both of us. This way, you keep your dignity." The recording ended. The room was airless. Miriam Chase watched Ethan, her expression unreadable. The notary's pen was poised over her log, verifying the playback. Arthur's posthumous voice returned, calm as a judge passing sentence. "Now you understand the first truth, Ethan. You didn't come to help me, you came to loot me. You saw a terminal diagnosis as a business opportunity. But here is the second truth. I'm not the confused old man you tried to manipulate that night." Arthur's recording explained that the study, like every room in his home, had a passive audiovisual security system installed after a break-in years prior. Ethan never knew. The system didn't just record, it uploaded encrypted copies to a private server in real time. The March 12th conversation was preserved in crystal clarity. Arthur had listened to it the next morning, and that was the day he truly began to write his final will. "But the recording is just evidence," Arthur's voice continued. "It's proof of intent. What matters is what I did with the time you thought I was wasting away. You were so busy negotiating with Carl Decker, you never noticed I stopped going to the corporate office. You assumed I was tired. I was working." Arthur described a 90-day period of furious, clandestine activity. He used encrypted channels to communicate with Miriam Chase and a separate, specialized firm in Delaware. He began disentangling Vance Global from the Vance Family Trust. He created a series of shell holding companies, a Russian doll structure of ownership that made the corporate landscape impenetrable to a casual buyer. He quietly transferred all patents, proprietary routing software, and key client contracts into a new, separate entity wholly owned by a charitable trust. He did this while sitting in his study, in his robe, looking every bit the frail patient Ethan believed him to be. "The company you tried to sell," Arthur said, "no longer existed in any meaningful form by the time you shook Carl Decker's hand. The valuable assets were gone. What remained was a brand name and a fleet of trucks, a hollow shell." In the conference room, Ethan finally found his voice. It was a strained whisper. "Turn it off. This is illegal, coercion." He was mentally incompetent. Miriam Chase spoke for the first time since pressing play. "The probate court has already reviewed independent psychiatric evaluations of Mr. Vance from that period, commissioned by the estate. 3 separate specialists found him to be of sound and exceptionally sharp mind. The recording is admissible as evidence of your undue influence and attempted financial exploitation. Which brings us to the next part of your father's message. Shall I continue?" Ethan sank back into the chair, defeated. He gave a single, stiff nod. Arthur's recording resumed. "The law has a term for what you attempted, Ethan, undue influence. It's a grounds for overturning a will, but I'm not interested in overturning mine, I'm enforcing it. The will you think you've inherited from, the one leaving you the trust, is designated as Will Alpha. It is a valid document, but it contains a triggered contingency. The playback of this recording and your verified listening satisfies the trigger. This activates Will Bravo, filed concurrently with the same court, but under seal." A new will. Ethan's head jerked up. Miriam Chase produced a second, thicker document from a briefcase beside her chair. She placed it on the table. "Will Bravo," Arthur explained, "acknowledges you as my biological son. It also details with evidence your attempted asset stripping and the grounds for disinheritance under our state's Slayer statute variations, which can apply to financial harm, not just physical harm. However, disinheritance is a blunt tool. I prefer precision." Will Bravo did not leave Ethan with nothing. That would have been too simple, too easy to challenge in court as punitive. Instead, it restructured everything. The $30 million family trust was dissolved. In its place, Ethan Vance was granted a 5-year renewable allowance. It was not called an inheritance. It was termed a family reconciliation stipend. The amount was $250,000 per year, a significant sum to most, a pittance to his expectations. It came with conditions. He must submit quarterly financial statements to the estate's executor. He must hold gainful employment of at least 30 hours per week, verified by pay stubs. He must attend and provide proof of attendance for weekly financial literacy and ethics counseling for the first 24 months. Failure to meet any condition would freeze the stipend. A second failure would terminate it permanently. The principle of the fortune, the real money, was redirected. A portion went to the employee pension fund, bolstering it by 15 million. Another chunk endowed a cancer research institute in his mother's name. The rest, the majority, flowed into the charitable trust that now held the company's valuable intellectual property. The trust's board would be appointed by the court, with Miriam Chase as the lifetime chair. And the final condition, Arthur's voice said, and for the first time a trace of emotion entered it, something like weary finality. You will listen to your mother's letters, the ones you locked away. Miriam has copies. You will listen to them start to finish in one sitting. Then and only then will the first stipend payment be released. You tried to monetize my death, Ethan, so I've tied your inheritance to your behavior. You get an allowance like the child you've chosen to remain. The man who tried to sell his father's company gets nothing. The recording ended with a soft click. The silence it left behind was absolute. Ethan Vance sat, his previously smug posture collapsed in on itself. He was no longer an heir. He was a defendant in a case that had already been decided, a beneficiary on parole. Miriam Chase slid the document across the table. Will Bravo, the court has already granted conditional probate pending your compliance with the stipulations outlined. Your signature here acknowledges you have heard the recording and understand the triggering contingency. It does not require you to agree, only to acknowledge. Ethan's hand trembled as he picked up the pen. He looked at the signature line. This wasn't acceptance. It was a receipt for his own defeat. He signed. The notary stamped and signed beside it, witnessing the moment the Vance fortune slipped through his fingers. But Arthur Vance's planning went one layer deeper. As Ethan stood to leave, hollow-eyed, Miriam Chase cleared her throat. One more thing, Ethan. Your father anticipated you might seek to challenge this, to sue the estate, to claim coercion. He left a final instruction regarding that. Ethan froze at the door. If you initiate any legal action against the estate, the trusts, or the executors, Miriam said, reading from a note, a second file is released to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the State Attorney General. It contains the full recording, your financial communications with Carl Decker, and evidence of your insider trading based on your father's confidential medical information. You wouldn't just lose the stipend, you'd risk criminal prosecution. The choice, as he said, is always yours. Ethan left without another word. He walked out of the offices of Chase and Lowe not as a billionaire heir, but as a man living on a tight, controlled leash. The story should end there, a satisfying, posthumous justice, but Arthur Vance was a strategist who thought in redundancies, and in a safe in Miriam Chase's office, there was a third, smaller envelope. On it, in Arthur's precise handwriting, was a label that read, "For Ethan's penance, Phase 2. The first part of the plan was containment. The second part was something else entirely. Phase 2 was not in the will. It was a set of private instructions, activated only if Ethan accepted the terms of Will Bravo without a lawsuit. Miriam Chase opened the envelope a week after Ethan's signature had dried. Inside was a letter and a small, encrypted flash drive. The letter began, "Miriam, if he's reading this, then he chose the leash over the cage. Now we see if he can learn to walk." Arthur's instructions were precise and utterly unconventional. He had created a false identity for his son. Ethan James Vance was to become Ethan James, a new hire in the logistics division of Vance Global, the hollowed-out shell of the company he'd tried to sell. His employee file would show a generic business degree from a mid-tier university and a spotty work history. His salary would be $45,000 a year. He would rent a small apartment in a modest part of the city, paid for from his stipend, which would now be his only source of extra income. The entire charade was to be managed by a single, trusted plant within the company's HR department. The goal was not humiliation for its own sake. Arthur's letter explained, he believes he was born to run this company because of his name. I want him to learn what it is to be a part of it without the name, to see the machinery from the ground floor. The people who keep it running don't have trust funds. They have mortgages. Let him understand where the real value is created. Ethan was summoned back to Miriam's office and presented with the choice. He could refuse. He could take his $250,000 annual stipend and walk away, living a comfortable but monitored and meaningless life. Or he could accept Phase 2. If he completed a full 12 months of employment, verified by his direct supervisor and the HR plant. With a satisfactory performance review, a portion of the restructured inheritance would be unlocked. Not the principal, but a one-time $5 million bonus deposited into a trust he could access at age 45. More importantly, he would earn a seat at the table, a real, non-voting advisory position on the charitable trust's board, a chance to have a say in his father's legacy. "It's a parole hearing," Ethan said, staring at the fake ID card with his photo and the name Ethan James. "More like an apprenticeship," Miriam corrected, "one your father never gave you because you never asked." Driven by a mixture of desperation, buried shame, and the faint glimmer of a future beyond an allowance, Ethan accepted. He cut his hair shorter, traded his tailored suits for off-the-rack khakis and button-downs, and moved into a one-bedroom apartment with noisy neighbors and a view of a parking lot. On a Monday morning in early January, he reported to the Vance Global Logistics Hub on the south side of Indianapolis. His job was in the Routing Coordination Department, a cubicle among dozens, inputting shipping manifests and troubleshooting delayed shipments. The first month was a study in invisible agony. Ethan was terrible at the job. The software was antiquated, the processes Byzantine. He was condescended to by his 22-year-old trainer, Lisa, who had been with the company for 3 years and knew the system inside out. He bit his tongue until it bled. The sheer scale of the operation, which he had only ever seen as spreadsheets and profit margins, became a visceral, exhausting reality. He saw the dispatchers who worked 12-hour shifts during peak season, the truck drivers who called in with breakdowns in the middle of the night, the warehouse staff who moved with a tired, efficient rhythm. These were the people he'd referred to as overhead during his vice presidency. Then in his third month, something shifted. A major client, a national retailer, was threatening to cancel its contract because of consistent late deliveries on a key route. The problem had stumped the senior coordinators for weeks. Ethan, working late on a Thursday, bored and frustrated, looked at the route map with fresh, desperate eyes. He saw the issue not as a logistics problem, but as a sequencing one, a holdover from his expensive, largely wasted business education. He proposed a radical resequencing of the hub's loading docks to match the geographic flow of the outbound trucks, rather than the client priority. It would require a temporary hit to efficiency for 2 other clients. He wrote up a one-page memo and, heart-pounding, slipped it into his direct supervisor's inbox. He expected to be ignored or fired. Instead, his supervisor, a weary man named Dan, called him into a cramped office the next day. "This is good thinking, James. Risky but good. We're gonna try it." The change was implemented. Within 2 weeks, the retailer's on-time delivery rate shot up to 98%. The client stayed. Dan clapped him on the shoulder, a simple gesture that meant more to Ethan than any boardroom compliment he'd ever received. He had fixed something. He had created value. This was the crack in the facade. Ethan began to apply himself, not for the inheritance, but for the quiet satisfaction of solving puzzles. He stopped seeing his co-workers as background characters and started learning their names, their stories. He heard about their struggles with healthcare costs, their pride in their kids, their quiet dedication to a company they had no idea his family had built. The cognitive dissonance was crushing and transformative. Meanwhile, Miriam Chase was monitoring his progress through the HR plant. She also began executing another part of Arthur's Phase 2. Using the encrypted flash drive, she accessed a series of numbered audio files. These were not for Ethan. They were for the other people in his life. File 1 was sent to Carl Decker, the would-be buyer. It contained a brief message from Arthur. "Carl, my son offered you a stolen company. You were willing to buy it. This recording is my insurance policy. If you ever do business with my son again, or mention his name in any deal, my lawyers will release this to your current investors. I wish you the best of luck in your future endeavors." Decker, a man who lived on reputation, immediately cut off all contact with Ethan. File 2 was for the board members of Vance Global, the ones Ethan had planned to manipulate. It assured them of the company's stability and informed them of the asset transfers, framing it as a strategic tax shelter. It thanked them for their service and attached generous, non-revocable bonuses for their loyalty. It neutralized any potential allies Ethan might have sought there. But File 3 was the most devastating. It was for Ethan's mother's sister, Aunt Clara, the recipient of the jewelry. Miriam Chase invited her for tea. She played the recording. In it, Arthur's voice was softer, filled with a regret he never showed in life. Clara, by now you know what Ethan tried to do. I've taken steps to protect Alina's legacy and the company, but I need one more thing from you. I need you to give Ethan the jewelry, not as a gift, as a test. Tell him you're getting older, you want him to have it, that it's rightfully his mother and should be with her child. Don't explain, just give it to him, then let me know what he does with it. Aunt Clara, confused but trusting Arthur's judgment, did exactly that. She met Ethan at a diner, slid the velvet case across the table, and delivered the lines. Ethan, stunned, took the case. He opened it to see the diamond necklace, the emerald earrings, the pieces he had once resented not getting. That night, he sat in his sparse apartment with $2 million worth of jewels on his coffee table. His initial, instinctive thought was to sell them. The stipend was tight. The bonus was years away. This was liquid. He could disappear, start over somewhere. He spent 3 days researching auction houses, his finger hovering over the send button on emails to contacts he hadn't spoken to in a year. On the 4th day, he didn't press send. He put the jewelry back in the case. He drove to Aunt Clara's house and handed it back to her. He said, "This was Mom's. It should stay with her family. You were her sister. It belongs with you." He didn't say it was a test. He didn't know it was. He said it because for the first time it felt true. Clara, following Arthur's instructions, reported this to Miriam. Miriam, sitting in her office, allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Arthur's bet was paying off. But the deepest cut of Phase 2 was still to come. The condition in Will Bravo about listening to his mother's letters had a deadline, the 1-year anniversary of Arthur's death. Ethan had been putting it off, dreading the sentimental guilt trip. Finally, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, he went to the safety deposit box, retrieved the stack of handwritten envelopes, and brought them to his apartment. He poured a glass of water, sat at his small table, and began to read. They were not what he expected. They were not lectures. They were not filled with disappointment. They were stories. Stories of him as a little boy building block towers. Stories of Arthur coming home exhausted but never too tired to read him a story. Stories of the early days of the company, the struggles, the triumphs his father never shared with him. The letters were a chronicle of love and quiet observation. The final letter, dated a month before her death, stopped his heart. "My dearest Ethan," it read, "I know you and your father are like two ships passing in the night, speaking different languages. He shows love by building walls to protect you. You seek love by scaling them to prove you don't need them. I see his fear in your ambition and your loneliness in his silence. When I'm gone, the bridge between you will be fragile. Please, for me, try to see the man behind the fortress. He is more afraid of losing you than he is of losing his company." Ethan read the letters 3 times. He cried, alone in his apartment, for the first time since his mother's funeral. He cried for the father he never understood, for the son he had chosen to be, for the years wasted in resentment. It was the emotional bedrock his father's logical, punitive plan had been designed to expose. A week later at work, a crisis hit. A key client's shipment of pharmaceutical goods was trapped by a sudden interstate closure due to chemical spill. The standard reroutes would add 18 hours, jeopardizing the temperature-sensitive cargo. The entire department was in a panic. Ethan, drawing on his now deep knowledge of secondary roads and his innate, previously misused cunning, sketched out a complex, unorthodox route using county highways and back roads. It was risky, unproven. He presented it to Dan, who looked at him, looked at the map, and said, "You sure?" Ethan nodded. "It'll work." Dan trusted him. The shipment was rerouted. It arrived with only a 90-minute delay, the cargo intact. The client was ecstatic. That night, Dan bought Ethan a beer at a nearby bar. "Where'd you learn to think like that, James?" he asked. Ethan, for the first time, almost told the truth. He swallowed it. "Just a different perspective," he said. Dan shook his head. "Nah, it's more than that. You've got a feel for it." The old man, Mr. Vance, he had that same feel. He'd come down here sometimes in his flannel shirt, just watching, asking questions. He said the answers were never in the boardroom. They were in the dirt. Ethan froze, the beer bottle halfway to his lips. His father had been here in the hubs, listening, learning. The man in the flannel shirt wasn't a costume. It was a uniform for the real work. In that moment, the two halves of his life, the failed heir and the competent Ethan James, collided. He saw his father not as a cold, withholding fortress, but as a master craftsman who loved the craft itself. And he saw, with horrifying clarity, that he had spent his life trying to own the workshop without ever learning how to use a single tool. He went home and wrote a letter, not to a lawyer, not to Miriam Chase. He wrote it to his father, Arthur Vance, care of the grave. He filled 3 pages with apologies, with understanding, with a nascent, hard-won respect. He had no way of knowing if it would ever be read. He mailed it anyway. The next morning, Miriam Chase received a notification. The HR plant submitted Ethan's 1-year performance review. It was glowing. Supervisor Dan's comments read, "Ethan James is the most promising talent I've seen in a decade. He learns fast, he cares about the work, and he's not afraid to get his hands dirty. I recommend promotion to junior logistics analyst, effective immediately." Miriam opened her desk drawer and removed the final item from Arthur's Phase 2 envelope. It was a smaller, sealed note. The instructions on the front read, "To be opened upon successful completion of Phase 2, as defined by verified employment and the voluntary return of the jewelry." She broke the seal. Inside was a single line in Arthur's handwriting. It was an address, not of a house or an office. The note said, 1407 Willow Lane, the garage. The combination is Elena's birthday. Miriam knew the place. It was a modest, detached garage Arthur had rented for years under a shell company, a place even she had never been. Phase 2 was over. The final lesson was waiting. The garage at 1407 Willow Lane was a nondescript cinder-block building in a row of identical units. Miriam Chase met Ethan there on a Saturday morning. She didn't have the combination, he did. Elena's birthday. He rolled up the heavy door. Inside wasn't a classic car or stacks of gold. It was a museum of a different kind. Parked in the center, meticulously clean, was a 1983 Ford F-Series pickup truck, faded blue, Arthur's first truck. On the walls were framed documents, the original business license for Vance Haulage, the first invoice ever paid, a grainy photo of a young Arthur leaning against that very truck, smiling in a way Ethan had never seen. Workbenches lined the sides, covered not with tools but with neatly labeled boxes. One was marked Lacey, his childhood nickname. Another, Elena. A third simply, the plan. On the truck's windshield was a single, sealed envelope. Ethan's name was written on it. His hands were steady as he picked it up. He'd been conditioned by now. Every piece of paper from his father was a landmine or a lesson. He opened it. "Ethan," it began in the familiar, precise handwriting, "if you are reading this, you have done 2 impossible things. You have listened, and you have learned. The garage is not part of the trust. It is mine, and now it is yours. The truck runs. I maintained it myself. The boxes contain the history I never shared because you never asked. The company's story is in board meetings. Our family's story is in here." The letter explained that the garage and its contents were held in a separate, revocable living trust that bypassed probate entirely. It transferred to Ethan upon the verification of 2 conditions, his successful 1-year employment and the voluntary return of the jewelry to Aunt Clara. Miriam had already verified both. This was a gift with no strings, no oversight committee. It was purely personal. "The money, the company, the trusts, that was business," the letter continued. "This is personal. This is the foundation. I built an empire from this truck. I want you to understand the weight of that, not just the number it became. You tried to sell a concept. I hope you've learned to value the substance. The $5 million bonus from Phase 2 will be deposited as promised. The advisory seat on the charitable trust is yours. But this garage, this truck, this history, this is your true inheritance. What you do with it will tell me, wherever I am, if you finally understood." Ethan sat on the truck's running board, the letter in his hands, and wept openly. Miriam Chase gave him the space, watching quietly from the doorway. It wasn't the money, it was the acknowledgement. The brutal, meticulous, punishing architect of his downfall had also, secretly, built a backdoor to redemption, and had believed, or at least hoped, he would find it. The following Monday, Ethan James walked into the Vance Global headquarters not as a secret heir, but as a newly promoted junior analyst. He also requested a meeting with Dan, his supervisor. He told him a partial truth. He said a distant relative had passed away, leaving him a small, unexpected inheritance. He wanted to invest it, not in stocks, but in the department. He proposed funding a new software pilot for dynamic route optimization, the kind he'd needed during the pharmaceutical crisis. He would lead the project team. Dan, astonished, took the proposal upstairs. It was approved. Ethan didn't touch the $5 million when it arrived. He placed it in a conservative trust, as his father might have. He lived on his salary and his stipend, which he continued to receive because he met all the conditions without complaint. He attended the financial counseling, not as a punishment, but as a student. He served on the charitable trust board, and his suggestions, grounded in his ground floor experience, were pragmatic and effective. A year after the garage, Miriam Chase called him to her office for the final time. The estate was fully settled. All conditions had been met or exceeded. There was, she said, one last piece of administrative business. Arthur had left a set of post-settlement instructions. She handed him a key and another address, a storage unit across town. Ethan went alone. The unit contained one item, a heavy, fireproof lockbox. Inside, he found his mother's original jewelry case, and atop it, his own handwritten letter, the one he had mailed to his father's grave. It had been opened. Paperclipped to it was a note card with 3 words in Arthur's handwriting, "I heard you." Final surprise was underneath. A new, shorter will dated just 2 weeks before Arthur's death. It was a codicil to Will Bravo. It stated that upon the satisfactory completion of all prior conditions and the positive recommendation of the estate executor, the family reconciliation stipend would be converted into a one-time $10 million grant, free of monitoring, to be used at the beneficiary's discretion. The stipend's controlling conditions were voided. The grant was awarded. Miriam explained that Arthur's definition of satisfactory completion was never just about checking boxes. It was about demonstrable change. She had submitted her recommendation the day Ethan funded the routing software project. He wasn't being rewarded for being good. He was being rewarded for becoming competent and for channeling that competence back into the foundation of the business. Ethan Vance, now 34, still lives in a modest apartment, though a slightly nicer one. He drives a sensible car. He wears a digital watch. He works full-time at Vance Global, where he has been promoted twice and is respected for his skill, not his name. The colleagues in his department know him as Ethan James, the quiet, sharp guy who solved the farmer route crisis. Only Dan, now his friend, has been told the full truth, and he keeps the secret. The Vance fortune, the bulk of it, remains in the charitable trust, growing and funding logistics innovation grants and cancer research. Ethan's advisory role lets him steer that legacy. He visits the garage on weekends, sometimes working on the old truck. He has dinner with Aunt Clara every month. The man who thought he was inheriting $30 million and a kingdom now has something his father never truly had: peace. And a purpose he built himself, inside the architecture his father designed to save him from himself. Arthur Vance's final judgment wasn't an impoverishment. It was a forced education. He didn't just redistribute wealth, he re-engineered an heir. The will was the trap. The recorded message was the trigger. But the inheritance, the real one, was only unlocked by the one thing Ethan had spent his life avoiding: genuine, humble, earned effort. Some fathers leave their sons fortunes. Arthur Vance left his son a mirror, a maze, and finally, a map. And in the end, that proved to be the only wealth worth having. So what do we make of Arthur Vance's final move? It was more than revenge. It was a recalibration. He understood that an unearned fortune is a curse, a weight that crushes the weak and corrupts the strong. So he designed an inheritance that couldn't be claimed, only earned. He turned his last will and testament into a teacher. We often think of legacy in terms of what we leave behind: money, property, a name on a building. Arthur Vance redefined it as what we pull forward. He didn't just leave his son wealth. He left him a path to become the kind of man who could handle it. The real inheritance wasn't in the trust documents. It was in the struggle, in the humbling, in the quiet victory of a solved problem and a returned heirloom. This story forces an uncomfortable question. What would we do if we knew our final words could shape a person's character, not just their bank account, but their very soul? Arthur had the cold genius to plan it, and the rare love to see it through. He loved his son enough to break him so he could rebuild him properly. That is a terrifying, profound form of care. In a world of instant gratification and spoiled heirs, the tale of the voice-activated clause is a modern fable. It reminds us that the most powerful traps aren't built to punish, but to correct. The real magic isn't in the legal trickery, but in the father's faith that his son could, under the right pressure, become diamond instead of dust. Ethan Vance walks through the world differently now. He knows the cost of things. He knows the value of work. And somewhere in a garage in Indiana, an old blue truck sits as a monument to the idea that every empire and every heir must be built from the ground up. If you found this story of posthumous strategy and redemption compelling, do us a solid. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm you want more narratives like this. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We dig deep into true stories of family, fortune, and the fascinating lengths people will go to for both. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next one.